Sarah as our keynote speaker today. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you.
I'll give you a little bit of background to Sarah and a tiny little recap on what's come before today, and then we'll ask Sarah to start her contribution. Sarah is Dr. Sarah Lister is UNDP's head of governance and oversees policy and program support to its governance portfolio globally. This includes electoral cycle support, parliamentary development, anti-corruption, legal identity, youth empowerment, disability inclusion. Sarah's more than 25 years of experience working on democratic governance, including civic engagement, media communication, social accountability, public administration reform. From 2015 to 2019, she was a director of UNDP's Oslo Governance Center, and she worked, among other things, also for the BBC Media Action, the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit in Kabul, and for the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. And Sarah has lived in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Europe. We met by coincidence in the early 90s in Nicaragua, and again at some conference in I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago in Brighton. And I'm delighted to see you here this time, Sarah. It's great to join us. I just want to quickly go over a little bit of what happened today and yesterday evening. The title of Sarah's keynote address is "Are Governance Systems Fit for Purpose?" and a reflection on the future and roles of governance and governance systems in tackling multiple challenges, including the COVID pandemic and climate change. And this follows on from this morning's contribution by Michelle Winthrop, the head of policy from Irish Aid and the Irish Development Corporation. While she was overall optimistic, she did concede that in climate action, we run the risk of getting it wrong through elite capture and a reduction in access to resources by previously accessible to vulnerable groups. So she gave us overall she was positive though, and gave us a really interesting local level example of climate adaptation in northern Kenya, and the peace dividend that came out of that. She also said it's incumbent on all of us that we make sure that the voices of the most vulnerable are heard in climate debates. We then had some great contributions from through a panel discussion that we had this morning. Sive O'Neill and Dermot Turney both spoke, both Irish climate activists, both spoke from COP26 in Glasgow. And Manisha Rao spoke from the University of Dubai, Mumbai. Sive and Dermot, along with some of our listeners, talked about, debated whether we should be optimistic or pessimistic about COP26 in general, and the mechanisms contained in previous climate agreements and possibly this current climate agreement that we may that may result from the current meetings. And I think the overall question was very much not so much optimism or pessimism around the resolutions, but more can we force our governments to take climate action seriously and actually use the various mechanisms contained within the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Agreement. We went as far back as that. You know, it's up to us as citizens to put pressure on our governments as well, is what Sive pointed out. Our chair, Nita Mishra, pointed out, or she shared a great localized example of climate litigation in Switzerland, and showing us that local action is often where where we can really where our hopes lie in many cases. Manisha Rao brought some very interesting and inspiring examples of local level climate action from Karnataka, and she also echoed the wonderful contributions that Gustavo Esteva delighted us with yesterday evening in his opening address. He was also speaking about lots of different things, but one of the things I really took away from that was about the local powerful action at local level, and about how local level can often catalyze greater change. He mentioned, for example, the Zapatista groups and how they're currently traveling in lots of different countries around the world. They were in Ireland recently, and sometimes local can become global and can really kind of develop into an important movement. So that's what we've had until now. Sarah, please delight us with your contribution. Thanks very much for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, Ellen, and to the committee and to all of you here. I know you're probably at the end of a long day, but I hope that I can add some further contributions to what you've already discussed. I think a lot of what the summary you've just given chimes with the sort of issues that I want to touch on in the next 25 minutes or so. And I do always enjoy these occasions when academics, policymakers, and practitioners come together, even if unfortunately we are not in the same room. You have just heard my bio, so you'll know that at different times I've had feet in different camps. So it's really very much a pleasure to be with you. And you've already been discussing, so you don't need me to tell you that COP26 and this conference come at a crucial point, with the world facing a triple crisis, from accelerating climate change to the unprecedented socioeconomic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, with an associated debt crisis, to the continued degradation of ecosystems and biodiversity. We've seen the COVID-19 pandemic wreak dramatic impacts across the political, economic, and social spectrum, reversing improvements in human development indicators for the first time in 30 years, and throwing structural inequalities at multiple levels into the spotlight. And today's environmental and climate crises are intertwined with inequality and inextricably linked to the protection and fulfillment of human rights and sustainable development, as I will talk about today. And these crises, separately and together, are having a profound effect on governance systems at all levels, stress testing institutions, state-society relations, and the ability of all stakeholders to adapt, and creating a vicious cycle which further undermines our capacities to respond. So in the next 25 minutes or so, I'd like to share with you some of my and UNDP's thinking on the future role of governance and governance systems in tackling these multiple development challenges and crises that the world is facing. So the key question that I'll speak to today is, how can we strengthen governance arrangements to promote inclusive human development, protect the planet, and provide the peaceful, just, and inclusive societies envisaged in the 2030 Agenda? And before I suggest some areas I think we should be prioritizing, which I think chime very well with what you've already heard in this conference, I want to reflect on a few challenges that we face. What is the state of our governance arrangements today? There are many statistics available and a lot of analysis that I could choose, but I will point to a few that I think are particularly pertinent. The global state of democratic governance is mixed. There have been more coups, for example, in 2021 than in the previous 5 years combined. There are increasing autocratization tendencies, with a continued pushback on women's rights and further closing of civic space in many contexts. And in the past 5 years, more than 70 countries have enacted laws to restrict freedom of association and to hamper the work of civil society. Yet, global protest movements and pro-democracy mass mobilization are at an all-time high, and we see a hunger for political engagement, broadly defined, especially from young people across the globe. To me, this shows a growing disconnect between the political systems we have and people's desire to engage politically. Although it is too early to assess long-term consequences, COVID-19 has had a negative impact on the global state of democratic governance, including through the exercise of emergency powers and curtailment of other rights, human rights abuses by state actors, restrictions on public participation, in which 56 countries have enacted measures that affect freedom of expression and 139 enacted measures that affect freedom of assembly, spiking of corruption, and in 78 places there were postponement of elections, although many of those have now taken place. I don't want to suggest that public health measures were not necessary, but it is the oversight, the application, and the timing of such restrictions that we should be mindful of, including whether they include appropriate sunset provisions. We have also seen high and rising levels of hate speech, misinformation, and a decline in independent media. Trust in government, politicians, and public institutions has continued to decline, despite some governments having received a bump in trust levels at the start of the pandemic. And I will speak more of that a little later. UNDP's Gender Social Norms Index shows that 47% of men and women across 75 countries say that they think men make better political leaders than women. The UN Women and UNDP COVID-19 Global Gender Response Tracker shows that men outnumber women 3 to 1 across COVID-19 government task forces around the world. Disproportionate representation will hamper women's recovery and women's ability to participate in societies. And finally, our global governance and multilateral arrangements are struggling. I won't say so much about this today, but I point you to the UN Secretary General's Our Common Agenda report, which represents his vision of how the UN can revive and revitalize multilateralism to more effectively address the challenges we face. And aside from these very challenging governance trends and more that I don't have time to mention, I think we also suffer from some challenges closer to home. As part of the international governance community, if there is such a thing, I think we struggle to find common language and direction in the overlap between development, environment, and democratic governance and human rights. That area where surely policy, practice, and research should increasingly be focused as we seek to address the multiple crises that we find ourselves in. This space is one in which we are often finding it challenging to understand each other. We come from different academic disciplines and use different frameworks. We have different acronyms. We are not always trained or incentivized within our professions, including academia, to think in an integrated way across multiple technical areas and to work across themes and disciplines to be able to think and act more broadly and more systemically. I see this on a daily basis in my work. Despite the best will in the world, we don't always understand the language and frameworks that others use. To be frank, what seems blindingly obvious to me is obviously often deeply mysterious to my colleagues. And yet it is a shared understanding, shared language, and shared frameworks that we need in order to ensure that the sustainable development and the transformation we urgently need to see happens. And this was one of the core drivers in the design of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. And I know this is what you are trying to achieve through this conference here and these conversations that we're having. And this is a challenge that we are trying to meet also at UNDP, including through implementing our new 4-year strategic plan, which promises a much more integrated and systemic approach to development. We are working through, in practical terms, what that actually means in how we think, how we plan, and how we work with our partners at country level. Democratic governance can benefit from insights from the resilience and sustainability discourses and practice, just as resilience and sustainability thinking can be strengthened through greater attention to rights and responsibilities, including a deeper understanding of the role of power, politics, and human agency as a means of continually renegotiating the social contracts that both create and respond to change. A number of global, regional, and national frameworks are already advancing links between principles of justice and ethics, good governance, rule of law, human rights, youth empowerment, gender equality, disaster risk reduction, environmental protection, climate change, and more. But our challenge is to implement them effectively, to establish greater policy coherence and synergies, to address the gap between policies and their implementation, to ensure the just transition towards green, more inclusive economies and societies. And what we have seen re-emphasized in the dynamics of the COP is that the change that we need is not only or I would argue primarily, a technical process of moving from a fossil fuel base to a low carbon system, but rather a deeply political process that will disrupt vested interests in the status quo, and which touches not only on issues of wealth, but geopolitical power, past and present. And my view is that it is responsive, inclusive, and accountable governance systems which will provide the scaffolding or the glue that connect the elements that we need to bring together to underpin the changes that we need. However, as I mentioned, in many contexts, there is a growing disconnect between public demand and government action on climate change and the environment. And in other places, there is public apathy, which requires creative and visionary leadership to ensure the actions we need. I was depressed this last weekend to read about a survey which showed that while people across 10 countries are alarmed by the climate crisis, most believe that they are already doing more to preserve the planet than anyone else, and few are willing to make significant lifestyle changes. The ability of our governance systems at different levels to incentivize individual, corporate, and governmental change and handle the transformations necessary is questionable at best. All development outcomes are a function of the political and power relations that exist between actors and institutions and the interests and incentives that guide decision-making and action. Political dynamics impact development outcomes irrespective of our ability or willingness to acknowledge or address them. They can be found in the disinformation strategies of political actors, which undermine social cohesion and trust in public institutions, in the drivers of gender inequality, and in why certain groups are left behind. They can also be found in stalled reform processes and an unwillingness to work beyond silos. I think we have become better at analysing these issues, but it is more of a challenge to constructively engage on the basis of that politically informed analysis. UNDP, like many other organisations, is questioning how we can be better equipped to identify those power dynamics at different levels, consider the development outcomes of imbalances, and support shifts when appropriate. But I think we still have a really long way to go on that agenda. So you talked a little bit about the optimism, pessimism. This so far has been very much on the heavy side of pessimism, which I have to admit tends to reflect my own outlook, if not my institution's outlook. But I promised at the beginning to suggest some concrete areas that I think merit more attention. And there are 3 areas that are especially important, I think, to strengthen the capabilities of our governance and political systems to manage these multiple challenges. The first area, which you have obviously already been talking about, is transforming local governance ecosystems for more collaborative governance at the local level. The second area is building and restoring trust within governance systems. And the third area is to reform governance systems to make them both more inclusive of youth and more responsive to future generations. And I'll say a few words about each, starting with the local governance issue, which I know you've already been discussing. For the vast majority of people, local governance remains the most accessible level of engagement with public authorities and state institutions. And we particularly saw this in the early stages of the pandemic, because the strong territorial dimension of the COVID-19 crisis exposed the importance of all countries to have resilient local communities and local governance ecosystems. But ensuring functional subnational governance is particularly challenging from a technical as well as a fiscal point of view. Challenges include ensuring that information flows and decision-making between governance levels are streamlined and understood by all, and mitigating the economic pressures faced by local authorities. Subnational governance frameworks tend to be more fluid and dynamic than their national equivalents, and subject to different sets of political and power dynamics, including with central governments. At the local level, we have also witnessed increased discrimination, new challenges to social cohesion, and weakened trust in institutions at precisely the time when the ability of governments to provide for their people is not able to meet the expectations they have of them. What is needed, and what will become more central in UNDP's governance support, is to engage entire local governance ecosystems to build new forms of collaboration between local actors and communities, different tiers of government, development partners, and the private sector. This demands new and innovative methods and partnerships, and importantly, better, more collaborative platforms for engagement that bring together this ecosystem of local governance actors to address challenges and agree on local solutions. Digital technologies can be helpful here, but we are also mindful of new exclusions and new challenges related to digitalization. And that could be the topic of a whole speech in itself. So I'm not going to develop it much further now, although if there's some questions, time for questions, we can talk about it later. One approach that we're working with at UNDP is that of social innovation platforms. These tackle interrelated local development challenges with a systems approach that helps to identify challenges experienced by communities and highlight their interconnectedness, break silos across sectors, maximize the use of public and private investments, and build new partnerships between different tiers of governments, the private sector and civil society. At its core, these platforms aim to strengthen public participation, trust in institutions, and facilitate area-based development in a more inclusive, integrated, and participatory manner compared to traditional vertical and one-off projects. In Thailand, Indonesia, and Pakistan, UNDP has supported such social innovation platforms, which have already sparked innovative collaborations between local communities, local governments, and the private sector for complex local development challenges such as food security, youth employment, and ecotourism, among other areas. The second area we need to emphasize is building and restoring trust within governance systems. Trust in institutions of the state, which is foundational to effective governance systems, rests on the ability of governments to demonstrate respect for the rule of law, human rights, and their accountability towards citizens. Trust is also heavily influenced by complex contextual factors, such as levels of social cohesion and the quality of the information ecosystem. The data shows that there are persistent age and gender gaps in trust, and that inequalities in income and opportunities, job insecurity, and social uncertainty undermine youth and women's confidence in institutions. Corruption and elite enrichment through misuse of public funds also continues to undermine public trust in governments and the services they provide. Like many other crises, the COVID-19 pandemic has provided a fertile ground for corruption to flourish. The uncertainty, disruptions, and emergencies present many opportunities for corrupt actors to take advantage of the crisis for private gain. And this is especially prevalent in countries where there are weak governance institutions, lack of transparency, accountability, and oversight, and limited supervision and enforcement. Apart from corruption exacerbating poverty and inequality and damaging social cohesion and eroding public trust, corruption is also undermining urgent global efforts to address climate change and ease planetary pressures. In the forestry sector alone, corruption costs some $29 billion US dollars annually, while corruption in the timber sector, fisheries, wildlife, and extractive industries continues to exacerbate environmental degradation. UNDP adopts an integrated approach to anti-corruption to accelerate climate action, build green economies, ensure universal health coverage, advance gender equality, and end poverty. And I think there are some really important insights emerging from researchers at the moment about the context in which anti-corruption measures are effective and when they are not. And I think those of us who are in programming organization need to work closely with those researchers to figure out how to integrate these insights into our programming, despite our project-based delivery logic. Another critical area related to trust in governance systems is the importance of providing access to accurate information. The COVID-19 crisis further exposed information asymmetries and dysfunctions facing many different population groups, excluding them or exposing them to misinformation or disinformation, fanning the flames of xenophobia and hate speech, and distorting democratic political processes. UNDP is working with governments and other partners to strengthen the integrity of information ecosystems in a range of countries, to support the dissemination of accurate information, and to reduce so-called information pollution in order to enhance not only the pandemic response, but also foster public debate, accountability, and trust in governance systems. Indeed, the COP26 summit has put the spotlight again on the pervasiveness and danger of climate misinformation online. A new analysis in The Guardian last week revealed that thousands of climate misinformation posts receive nearly 1.5 million views every day. Investing in building the integrity of information ecosystems, including ensuring the survival of independent media and journalism, is critical to ensuring societies can engage in the dialogue essential for healthy societies and a healthy planet. A further challenge we face is that most political and governance systems suffer from short-termism. Our democratic political systems incentivize short-term delivery, whatever the long-term cost, and are therefore not only failing to provide good global public goods in the long term, but also failing to protect principles of intergenerational equity and the rights of future generations. With more than 1.8 billion young people in the world, of whom 90% live in developing countries, youth are critical stakeholders in environmental action, but particularly excluded from those spaces. They remain underrepresented in decision-making processes due to the lack of technical, political, and financial support, and discrimination related to age, gender, experience, and capabilities, as well as lack of access to information. Several countries have recently developed various mechanisms to steer governance away from short-termism by introducing parliamentary committees for the future, for example, by producing reports on the future, establishing foresight units, and adopting well-being of future generations legislation. All of these things aim to bring long-term goals to the heart of our governance practice, and they are important approaches to watch and learn from, and our societies need to be learning from each other on such measures. And in addition to these future-oriented mechanisms, we need to continue to invest in meaningfully engaging with youth, supporting youth capacity development, youth-led climate and other development initiatives, and creating enabling environments for youth empowerment. So where does all this leave us as we consider climates of and for development? Although much of what I've said today is not very optimistic, I do think there are reasons not to lose hope, and I've highlighted those 3 specific areas which I think are particularly important to pursue. And as I wrap up, I would note that although there is always more research to be done, we do know a lot. There are decades of good research on many of these issues that I've raised, much of which is done by institutions such as those here with us today. But research also shows that the application of it is dependent on a whole host of factors, which it can be very, very difficult to shift. We know that it is a combination of global and regional factors and much more local processes, which will support progressive change in societies. At a national and subnational level, such change is usually a combination, I think, of leadership, political participation, and civic engagement. And sometimes it seems to happen very quickly, but mostly it takes a really long time. Longer than our grant agreements, research grants, results frameworks, and our need for strategic communications allow for. In my view, the role of external development actors, whether we sit in UNDP or bilateral agencies, research institutions, NGOs, or anywhere else, must be to support those endogenous processes of change, while providing the supportive global and regional multilateral frameworks required for the provision of global public goods. That is how we shall create climates for development. And this requires different disciplines and different specialisms to come together to learn each other's frameworks and language across the evidence, policy, practice space, in spaces such as this. So I've been happy to be here with you, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That's great. It was really, inspiring, not always optimistic, as you said yourself, but at the same time, I think it's important to, to draw out some of the challenges that we're facing, and not always to be naive of some of these challenges, because sometimes I think if we're being over optimistic, or if we choose not to see or to ignore some of the governance challenges and boldly kind of, progress with grand statements and great ideas on how we're going to change the world, you know, things may not actually happen unless we're very aware of the challenges that are there. I just want to know if there's anyone else who wants to go first on with a question. I have some questions here as well, but I want to give people an opportunity to come in with their questions. One of my colleagues was going to keep an eye on the chat. Let me know who, if anyone did come in with some questions.
Yeah, assuming has, thank you, Sarah, again. I am the colleague who said I'll keep an eye on the chat.
Okay.
So assuming has a question, but I think Jared wants to jump in here.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. That was an excellent overview. And indeed gives us some direction in terms of what we can anticipate. I have just a thought on, we call it challenges. Effectively, it's obstructional governments, political entities that deliberately go out of their way to obstruct development. And I'm thinking particularly in what we have in the likes of Sudan at the minute, which is a desperate situation, absolutely to do with obstructional parties within that particular environment. It's a hard one to overcome. How does the UN engage with the likes of a coup d'etat, or indeed organizations that deliberately go out of their way to obstruct development?
Do you want me, shall I answer that one, or are we doing a round? Either is fine with me. Shall I just tackle that one? Okay, I mean, there is no magic answer to that, but one of the reasons there are many reasons I like working for the UN, but one of the things I find helpful is obviously different parts of the UN are mandated to do different things. So while I work for the development program of the UN, and some of our, you know, we are very focused on development, there is also the peace and security and the human rights pillars of the UN. At a country level, there is what we refer to as the good offices of the UN. And it's the capacity to bring together the diplomatic with the development, with the technical, with a range of other instruments that in the types of contexts you mention, the UN seeks to bring together. And it's that capacity to engage in theory in all those ways that we would look at doing. So in a context, for example, where there has just been a coup, and that I said there have been more this year than in the last 5 years, you know, the development arm would not be making particular statements necessarily on some of these issues, but there are other channels and other mechanisms to engage on that. So I don't know if that partially answers it. We are, as the UN, you know, and on these agendas, we are constantly reminded that we are a membership organization. There are issues of sovereignty. And those are the debates and the discussions that are had in the Security Council, in the General Assembly, in many other fora, and that we have to be mindful of. So even things that can seem quite innocuous and fairly technical to us, like, for example, issues around the social contract, can raise enormous issues with member states around sovereignty. And so it's some of those types of balancing that the UN has to take into account.
Okay, thank you.
You're looking skeptical. Is there?
No, I think I think over the years and working in sort of various development capacities, there's almost a profile of obstructional organizations or obstructional agents across all of these regions. And for the mind of me, we haven't been able to sort of crack that one yet. How do you how do you get these groups, these governments, these sort of disruptive elements to, in effect, stand down? It's a perennial problem, and as I say, for the mind of me, I haven't been able to find an answer to this one. So
I think it's lots of. I mean, if I may, I do think it's lots of ways. There will be the global pressure. There will be the UN. There's very often regional pressure as well. That, you know, the regional pressure is really often more effective than the global pressure in many contexts. But then there is also, from the development perspective, as I said in my speech, I think it's around these endogenous processes of change that we need to be supporting as external actors. I think we have to be really humble about what we think we can achieve, and need to be creating the enabling environment for the internal political processes. And for me, you know, something I have a big focus on at the moment is the information ecosystem, which is something that I discussed a lot, because the changes that are taking place and the collapse of independent media and the misinformation, the disinformation, but also just the lack of access to accurate information and the spaces for debate. And all of the things that now hit the press in terms of concerns in many of our countries, but also are in the countries in which we work. I think that's a really critical area and we will increasingly see our democratic processes under pressure unless there are some significant changes on that issue. But it is all, I think it is, it's the, you know, some of it's the information, it supports the civil society, it's supporting local level processes, that coupled with the global and the regional and the diplomatic.
okay, thank you.
That's great. Sorry, Nita, can
you
give,
before I read out?
Sorry.
I can hear.
Can you hear me better? Or am I? Okay, thank you. So I was just connecting from what Jared said and what Sarah said and all the other speakers. In fact, Gustavo also spoke about that, you know, local governance being the key to development, to further, that's the future. And that's what we should be focusing. How different is it from globalization or the call for globalization?
I think what we're seeing is a recognition of multi-level. And that's the complexity that we are trying to work with at the moment. That before, you know, I think we perhaps have a very traditional vertical view of, you know, there's the global and then there's the regional and then there's the national and then there's the local, and you kind of things go in this direction and maybe sometimes they go in that direction. Whereas actually the way that our systems are functioning are much more multi-level, and that local groups may be connecting across the globe through some of the information platforms that we have, that globalization pressures are affecting very much at the local level, and sometimes the regional comes in and the national comes in, and it's all just it's an ecosystem that looks very different and isn't the vertical one that perhaps we've been trained to think about and analyze according to. And I think that that's why some of this, you know, the political economy analysis, the local analysis, the social innovation platforms I talked about, which will look in a particular context at how that confluence of factors are coming together and affecting people's lives in that place, are playing out. So I think it's that multi-level, much more complex picture that we see.
Thank you, Sarah. I just, Suming, Hugh, can you bring Suming in to, you know, talk about her question? Okay. Yeah, thanks. So, Suming, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm just, okay, is this working? The video is muted, but I think the audio is working now.
Yeah, we can hear you, yes.
Yeah, so my point really was, well, first I kind of have a remark about the silos. because I think the silos, this shibboleth of the silos is very much something that blames people for something that they're put into, because most people live in social structures and structures of resourcing and commandment that require that. For example, I live in a silo because I'm a sociologist and I have to, publish in sociological journals or whatnot. But it's not because, I wouldn't publish in other kinds of newspapers or whatever, but they wouldn't count. And I do that, but anyway. But so it's just a remark about the silos and not kind of just allowing that to be a hostage to fortune. The second thing, though, the main thing, is really about how we think about global governance and what we're not thinking about. Because you've made really pertinent and useful remarks about what the problems are of thinking around the silos, what the problems are with people, that they're not willing to change their behavior, they're stuck in their siloed way of thinking, and the problems with politics, that they're these corrupt actors in politics. And also you've given us real hope that youth are the hope for change, and they demand change and that we are accountable to them. But really the multilateral system of development and of governance that we are speaking about at the moment consists of countries, about 200 or so country governments. But if you think about the 200 most powerful entities, economically speaking, in the world, a very small minority of these are governments. Only 43 are governments, 157 are corporations. And this means there's a massive asymmetry of power between the major corporate actors on one hand, and the governments and communities that we expect to be cooperating with the corporations on the other hand. And so we keep talking about joint solutions in partnership with the corporate sector, but these are terribly asymmetrical. They're not really able to represent people's interests in any meaningful way. And I agree, it's important to address corruption, but it's not just people who are corrupt, or politics and governments that are corrupt. How do we make corporations answerable and accountable for their actions? Because they're mostly governed in the international system through voluntary mechanisms, parallel mechanisms, highly technical legal mechanisms that they predominate, and this asymmetry of power is a feature. So if we're talking about how good governance, how can we bring accountability and answerability of corporations back into the arguments that we have for good governance and link them to the protection and non-destruction of global public goods? And that our concept of global public goods is still stuck in the state failure model. And we're not really thinking beyond that impasse between market failure and state failure to actually come up with a theory of global public goods that actually protects them and promotes them.
Okay, there was a lot in there. I will pick off some pieces of it, and now I see you, which is great. And just on the silo piece, yeah, I mean, it's why I accept one of the reasons I think groupings like this are really important to help with that cross silo aspect. And actually, my reflection, as I've been in the US for a couple of years, is that Europe is a lot further advanced. That, you know, there's much more space for that cross-disciplinary work in European academic context than there is in the US. But you asked the really tricky questions around global governance and the role of the private sector in that, and I didn't focus so much on that. And I'm not going to come up with a theory of global public goods, but I can tell you a little bit about some of the thinking that's going on in the UN system at the moment on it, and then I'll leave much cleverer people than I am to come up with the theory of global public goods. So I think all that you say is really well recognized and really well understood, including by the UN Secretary General. And I think there's different levels that these things are being tackled at. So one of the projects that UNDP works at is in Asia on business and human rights. Very successful entry point, particularly into many Asian contexts where it's not a corporate social responsibility at all, program at all, because I know there's a lot of questions about that. It's not an area that I cover specifically myself, so I may not have all the details, but there's a specific global regulation that was introduced that many organizations needed to comply with. And I'm sorry, I can come back to you with what it is. I should have the details, but I don't. And so actually what we've been doing is supporting combinations of businesses and civil society organizations to look at what compliance with some of this regulation means and to shift practice in that way. And the reason I say it's being successful is because we are actually seeing practices shift as a result in relation to supply chains and so forth. So there's that kind of more granular level of supporting organizations and people to work together to shift according to the governance and regulatory systems we have. And then there is all the level up to the question you raise about, well, the UN is 200 countries, but they're not the powerful ones. And also it goes back a little bit to Gerard's question about, well, if governments are the problem and governments are the ones supposedly representing all of this at the UN, what do we do about it? So I mentioned in my speech the UN Secretary General's Common Agenda report. And really that is his vision for the next 4 years of how we need to be trying to address some of these issues, and how there are many voices, different voices from youth who are perhaps excluded, and civil society who don't always have entry points in some of these discussions, to some very powerful entities that don't engage with these discussions. And how can the multilateral system, the UN in particular, be responding to this changed environment? So there's a raft of measures in there, some 70, I think, from which range from very big to relatively small. There's not small, but difficult. You know, there's some around anti-corruption, some around legal identity. There's all sorts of things in there, and some of them, frankly, may not fly. You know, I mentioned also there's concern among member states around some of it and so forth. But it's to acknowledge what you raise, that I think even within the UN system, the Secretary General realizes that there's quite a lot of work to make the UN system fit for purpose, and this is his one of his mechanisms for doing so. There are other mechanisms, you know, other frameworks we have. Agenda 2030, the call for action on human rights, and so forth. So yes, super important issues, critical issues you raise, and let us all hope that we see some progress on some of them.
Thank you. And there's another question. I don't know, Su-Ming, do you want to come in? Otherwise, there's another question from Dixon, who's asking about how do we strengthen the trust in local government ecosystems? And I think that's a really interesting question as well. My follow-up questions would be also, who should be the person or the entity helping to strengthen trust in local government ecosystems? And and again, I think sometimes in the context as well of governments who may not always care that they're not trusted.
And perhaps governments that shouldn't be trusted also. So, I mentioned the Common Agenda report, and I don't want to go on and on about it. I was involved in some of the background work in relation to trust in that report, and you will see trust talked about there. And certainly the point that I was keen to put forward is, especially when I heard a lot at the start of the pandemic about trust in government. We need trust in government, which from a public health perspective, I understand the logic of it, but there are many governments that actually I don't think should be trusted, and their messaging shouldn't necessarily be trusted. And so what we've also tried to do is shift to sort of trust in governance systems and trust in democratic governance systems and governance institutions, rather than individual governments or individual politicians or individual leaders, because that can very quickly become a route to a very unhealthy populism. So I think and I look quite closely at some of the academic work around trust and in trying to frame this. So I would slightly reframe Dixon's question in terms of local governance rather than necessarily local government, and I think it is. I mean, I mentioned in the speech, it's around accountability mechanisms being in place. It's around accurate information. It's around inclusion, including of minorities. And it's about having accountable and effective inclusive governance processes and systems in place. And there will be many angles from which to approach that.
That's great. That's really, really good. Any other questions for anyone? I have a question still that I was hoping to ask. You talked earlier about, we started off really with this idea of climate change and governance. And do you think that some of the kind of the mechanisms for climate change finance, or like for climate resilience and climate financing can have a positive effect on governance, or can basically, I'm kind of interested in hearing how you feel about both the the kind of the large provisions of financing for low-income countries to do something about climate change, and are they going to be, or do you feel, are you optimistic or pessimistic in terms of their effect in kind of creating space for people to act positively, and also, or are you fearful that the governance systems are sometimes in some countries too weak to really make a positive impact on climate?
At the moment, I'm agnostic on it. Actually, I think they have the potential for both. Actually, and I think there is a scope for them to go either way, and to some extent, this comes back to my concern that Su-Ming pulled me up on around the capacity to talk between the for governance people to enter those discussions where those types of issues are being talked about. So I don't know very many experts, governance type of experts, who are able to engage credibly in the climate finance space. And I would say I am not one of those. I wish I were. I really wish I were. I had a bit of a career change in 2013, and I almost went off and did a master's in environmental science. And I wish I had. Sometimes, I don't really, but that would have taken me in a different direction, because even within my own organization, and we work a lot with some of the vertical funds and the big climate finance, I'm not sure that we have the capacities that we need at the moment. We're looking to strengthen them to be able to engage on those types of issues at the country level and the local level. So it's huge amounts of money in many cases, and the potential for good is there, and the potential for capture and wastage and all the rest of it, and everything pernicious that you can think of is there. So am I confident that we have the safeguards in place? Not sure. This is being recorded. I need to say I need to make clear that my own institution has its eyes very much on, all those all those safeguards and ensuring, all of that. I think you understand me, but I'm taking a broader view in terms of the global landscape.
Thank you. Yes, I can certainly imagine. And I think it's very hard to pull you up on a verdict, about every single, about the possibilities of success in every single country, because there is such a wide variety even within low-income countries. Well, what may go well in some may not work so well in others.
Can I just come in here? Thanks, Sarah. I just wanted to add that you said that the youth there's a hunger for political engagement by the youth. And I was just, linking it to Gustavo yesterday and, about Greta and all the, this youth involved in political activism, climate activism. What do you think about that? And I kind of got a feeling that according to me, I think there should be the capacity that you're looking for to build is probably this youth, which is hungry for political engagement. And that's where our future lies.
I agree, and with UNDP, we are working a lot on kind of meaningful engagement with youth. I felt like I was going on a bit, so I cut out some of my examples of how we've been working with young people in many countries, in Argentina, in terms of preparation for COP and creating spaces for young people to engage, and also insisting that young people are on panels and young people are at the table, and we do that quite a lot, ensuring that when people are talking about these issues, that actually young people have a voice. And obviously they're not homogeneous, and we know all of that there are imbalances and intersectionality of discrimination and all of that. So I think there's multiple ways that we can support that, from insisting that young people's voices are heard in some of these fora, to supporting quite grassroots youth-led initiatives. I agree. It's the majority of the population now, I think, isn't it? Certainly in many countries, it's young people who are excluded from political mechanisms for one reason or another make up the majority of the population.
Thanks, Sarah.
Can I just chip in on that? And I absolutely agree in regards to the need for the voice of young people right across all of these debates, in terms of everything from conflict, climate change, even through the whole discussion around COVID and COVID mitigation and recovery. Indeed, I do have a concern as an educator, though, that we're weighing a lot of responsibility on young people, and probably it's about the way in which development education can adapt to these questions. But I think essentially with education, we need to direct young people towards, I think what we could best describe as sort of the hopeful outcome. My problem is that some of the voices could be quite difficult for young people to deal with, and particularly younger children, I have to say. It's just a thought, I have to say. Just a thought.
You mean exposing younger children to climate anxiety type of issues, or that they will themselves, they're not accepted in these spaces and that's a difficult process for them?
It's climate anxiety that we'd be worried about.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm the mother of two teenage boys, and my son has been vegan since the age of 6, and partly for climate reasons. And I admire his tenacity and his commitment. But I don't want him growing up with the feeling that it all either the feeling that it all rests on his shoulders, or that the world that he's inheriting, you know, isn't going to be worth living in. And so this is a personal reflection, not a work-related one. I don't know the answer to that at all. If there's others who can have dealt with it, or you know, who have some suggestions on those types of issues, I'd really like, as a parent, I'd really like to know.
There's Neve Flynn here who's just put in the chat, as a young person.
Excellent.
Want to speak? She's a student, I know.
Please, Neve.
I don't know whether
to do his magic on the.
Yeah. But anyway, Neve says, as a young person and the co-chair of the Global Youth Network, I would say a large amount of stress comes from the feeling of frustration of inaction of people in positions of power. There is Neve, yeah.
All right, I was just looking, I need to unmute there as well. Yeah, I just was, so actually kind of in relation to that question in particular, I'm based with a lot of youth groups and youth organizations, and as I mentioned there, I'm the current co-chair of the Global Youth Network, who my fellow co-chair is based in Zambia. And I was talking when you were talking, and I suppose my other background is that I work with children at a primary level, both in special education needs and at a primary level in the Irish school system. So I talk a lot with the children about different things that come up around the world that they're interested in. And I was actually in a classroom with 11 and 12-year-olds yesterday, and I suppose two things that are kind of blatantly in my face a lot are, one is the stress amongst young people around climate change and things. Often it comes more from the frustration and the feeling of powerlessness when it comes to when you're in the group and you're supposed to be a part of meaningful youth participation, and the people that still hold the power for the decisions in the group are nodding at you, but they're not making decisions based on what you're saying, so that you have a very clear message, you're repetitive in what you're saying, you're clear in what you're saying, and then continually you hear that there's no outcome from what you've put in. So a goal are trying to address that with giving us a position of power in the youth network in influencing policies and things. But I think that overall, that stress there's more stress around people in power not acting on things like climate change as opposed to the climate change itself. So that's kind of from the youth angle. And then from the angle of children at a primary level, so like ages maybe, well, 5 to 12 is the age of primary school in Ireland, but maybe like 8 to 12 in those classes, I find that their curriculums, the development education is not even a part of the Irish curriculum in itself, and it's slightly lumped in with history, geography, and science, which are three massive subjects, as part of the new curriculum in primary education in Ireland. And I suppose their books are super outdated in terms of yesterday I was teaching about water pollution, and so I brought up a lot of my own resources around water pollution, because their books are talking about oil spills that happened 20 years ago in the sea and how that damages the environment, and the kids know more than that about climate change, and they know more about water pollution than their books are telling them. So in terms of the curriculum being outdated and not relevant to their world in a so-called developed country like Ireland, then I think like that causes them stress too, because it's as if the school and educators are lying to them about what's happening, and they feel a disconnect between how they perceive the world and how people in positions of power are telling them about the world. So I suppose it's a power dynamic on a different level.
That's really, thank you so much for sharing that, Neve.
Yeah, so I suppose to just conclude from my perspective to you in sharing that, it's that I think that the power dynamic that exists between any one person and another person can really influence how someone feels about a situation. And so I think like even that, Sarah, you came to talk to us and that there's an opportunity for me to speak at this conference is like a sharing of power. But I think as well as that, there's a lot of people around the world who I know people that I don't have access to this conference because they don't have access to technology or things like that. There's always that issue. But I suppose like a little emphasis on where meaningful youth participation means more when power and responsibility are put into the hands of the youth.
Thank you, Niamh. We actually have two very active development educators here, Jared McCann himself and Hugh, who's behind the cameras, who can probably solve a bit of your crisis in terms of curriculum and all. But thanks, Sarah, for bringing up these issues, and thank you, Niamh, for jumping in. I was hoping you would actually for a long time. You've been
Thank you, Niamh,
since all day.
Yes, I think it's a really, it's a good note to end on. I think Niamh really pulled up some interesting, just draw our attention to something really interesting, how even something like an outdated school book can, can in some ways create a certain amount of distrust in government. And that is just because something, like not enough attention has been paid to a particular issue that is of great concern to children as young as 10 and 11 and even younger. And I think that's just really important for all of us to bear in mind, that there's so many ways in which we don't pay attention to the young children in our midst, and lots of different ways in which our government systems and our governance systems are kind of designed in such a way that don't create space or don't really take account of people's thoughts and feelings and ideas and real need to share that power and to be part of the decision-making process at all levels. Thank you again, Niamh, and thanks, Sarah. Do you want to leave us with a last thought, and then I'll wrap it up for today?
Not really. I think you've heard more than enough from me today. It would have been good to have heard more from Niamh and others who are also online, who I'm sure also have important perspectives to share. But thank you again for the invitation. It's been a pleasure to meet you all, and hope that we can meet in person possibly at some point. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sarah.
To have you here. Thanks, everyone, and I hope to see many of you again tomorrow at the at all our conference events tomorrow. And have a good evening for this evening. All the best.
Thank you, everyone.